Some people aren't afraid of the world, they are just tired of it. Not the loud, dramatic kind of tired that announces itself with breakdowns or slammed doors, but the quiet kind. The kind that settles slowly into the bones until one day you realize the outside world feels heavier than it used to. Conversations feel longer, crowds feel sharper, even simple invitations. Come hang out with us start to feel like small emotional obligations instead of opportunities. And so you stay home, not because you hate people, not because you're antisocial, not because you've given up on life, but because home feels like the only place where your nervous system can finally unclench. For people who love staying at home, there is often an invisible story behind the habit, a psychological landscape that most outsiders never see. From the outside, it can look like laziness, avoidance, or even loneliness. But on the inside, it often feels like survival. Home becomes something deeper than a building. It becomes a sanctuary. And sanctuaries are usually built by people who had to protect themselves from something. If you look closely, many people who deeply prefer staying home carry a quiet history of emotional overstimulation, not always dramatic trauma. Sometimes it's something far more subtle and far more common. Microtrauma, tiny emotional cuts repeated over years, moments where a person felt judged, misunderstood, ignored, rejected, pressured to perform, expected to be someone they weren't ready to be. Each moment by itself seems small, almost forgettable, but the mind keeps score in ways we rarely notice. Imagine a well that slowly loses water, not because someone drained it in one moment, but because tiny cracks formed in the stone walls over time. Drop by drop, the well empties. For many people who prefer staying home, social life can feel like drawing water from a well that no longer refills easily. Every conversation costs something. Every gathering drains a little more, and eventually, the mind learns something important. Home is where the well stops leaking. Inside the quiet of familiar walls, something begins to repair itself. The nervous system relaxes. The pressure to perform fades. There is no need to interpret facial expressions, manage impressions, or measure your words carefully. At home, you can exist without being watched. And for many people, that is a rare and deeply healing state. But this preference for staying home usually didn't appear overnight. It often develops slowly, like emotional erosion. In childhood, many people who later become home-oriented adults were unusually sensitive observers. The kind of children who noticed shifts in tone, subtle tension in a room, the way adults spoke differently when they were upset. Psychologists sometimes call this high emotional attunement. These children grow up learning to read the emotional weather around them. They become good at sensing when something is wrong, even when nobody says it out loud. The problem is that emotional attunement can slowly turn into emotional exhaustion, because when you constantly monitor other people's moods, social spaces stop feeling relaxing. They become something else entirely. They become work. The brain begins to scan constantly. Did I say the wrong thing? Are they annoyed with me? Why did their tone change? Should I respond differently? Most people don't consciously think these questions, but the nervous system does. It runs them in the background like silent software, and over years, this creates what psychologists sometimes describe as social fatigue. Not fear of people, just fatigue. Fatigue from interpreting too much, fatigue from performing the right emotional responses, fatigue from feeling responsible for keeping interactions smooth. Eventually, home becomes the only place where the emotional scanning finally turns off. No reading the room, no adjusting your personality. Go! No subtle pressure to be entertaining, interesting, funny, confident, productive, outgoing. Just silence, and silence for the overwhelmed mind feels like oxygen. There's another hidden layer to this psychology. Many people who deeply love staying home have experienced what researchers call ambiguous belonging. They were never completely rejected by the world, but they were never fully embraced either. Maybe they had friends, but always felt slightly different. Maybe they were invited to social spaces, but often felt like an observer rather than a participant. Maybe they learned early that being themselves sometimes made others uncomfortable, so they adapted, they smiled at the right times, they said the expected things, they played roles that helped them fit in. But deep down, something always felt slightly out of alignment, like wearing clothes that almost fit but never perfectly. Over time, that subtle misalignment can create a strange emotional phenomenon. You begin to feel more like yourself when you're alone, not because you dislike others, but because solitude removes the pressure to shape-shift. Inside your own space, your personality doesn't have to negotiate with anyone else's expectations. You can think slowly. You can move slowly. You can exist without explanation. And after years of adjusting yourself to fit external environments, that freedom feels incredibly powerful. The outside world, in contrast, can begin to feel like a stage. And stages are exhausting places to live. There is also something deeper happening in the brain. When someone repeatedly experiences overstimulation in social environments, too many conversations, expectations, noises, emotional signals, the brain starts associating outside spaces with cognitive load, not danger, just effort. Psychologically, the mind begins categorizing environments into two types: energy-draining environments and energy-restoring environments. For many home-loving people, the outside world slowly became categorized as the first type: busy places, social obligations, crowded rooms, unpredictable interactions. All of these require mental processing. Home, on the other hand, becomes categorized as the second type: predictable, controlled, safe. You know where everything is. You know what sounds will happen. You know no one will suddenly ask you to perform socially. The nervous system begins to relax even before you walk through the door. This is why some people feel an almost immediate wave of relief when they arrive home. Not happiness exactly, more like decompression, like a diver finally reaching the surface after being underwater too long. And here's the important part most people misunderstand. Loving to stay home does not mean someone lacks a social soul. In fact, many home-oriented people are deeply thoughtful about human connection. They crave meaningful conversations, depth, understanding, but shallow, high-volume social environments often feel draining rather than fulfilling. Small talk can feel like emotional static. Crowds can feel like noise over signal, so the mind makes a quiet calculation. If connection is rare in these environments and exhaustion is guaranteed, why keep going? The answer becomes obvious. Stay home. Protect your energy. Wait for the rare moments of real connection instead of chasing constant interaction. To outsiders, this can look like isolation. But from the inside, it feels like emotional conservation. There is also something else that slowly develops over time: a rich inner world. When someone spends a lot of time at home, the mind doesn't necessarily become empty. In many cases, it becomes deeper. Books are read, ideas are explored, thoughts are examined from different angles. Imagination expands. Solitude becomes a place where the mind can wander without interruption. For some people, staying home is not an absence of life. It's where life quietly happens. But here is where the story becomes more complicated. Because what begins as a refuge can slowly become something else. A wall. At first, staying home feels restorative, healing, necessary. But over time, the mind starts reinforcing the pattern. Outside equals effort. Inside equals safety. The brain loves patterns like this. It protects them. And before long, the sanctuary becomes slightly harder to leave. Not because the person is weak, but because the nervous system has learned something powerful. Home is the only place where nothing demands anything from you. And the longer that association strengthens, the more the outside world begins to feel like an unfamiliar landscape, even if nothing dangerous is actually waiting there. This is the invisible wall many home-loving people eventually encounter. A wall built not from fear, but from comfort. And comfort, when it becomes too protective, can quietly reshape a person's entire life without them realizing it. Because one day, you wake up and notice something strange. You didn't choose to stay home today. Your mind chose it for you. And that realization raises a quiet, unsettling question. What if the place that once protected you is now the place that's keeping you hidden? What if the place that once protected you is now the place that's keeping you hidden? At first, that thought can feel unfair, even accusatory, because staying home was never about hiding. It was about breathing again. It was about recovering from a world that often felt loud, demanding, and emotionally crowded. It was about finally having a place where your mind didn't need armor. But the human brain has a quiet tendency to turn protection into permanence. Anything that keeps us safe long enough can slowly become part of our identity. And once something becomes identity, it becomes difficult to question. You stop saying, "I like staying home today," and you begin saying, "I'm just the kind of person who stays home." It sounds like a small shift in language, but psychologically, it changes everything because preferences can change. Identities resist change. So the invisible wall grows thicker. Days pass where you could go out, but you don't feel like it. Weeks pass where invitations appear, but they feel slightly heavier than they should. Months pass where your world quietly shrinks without any dramatic moment marking the change. Not because you're afraid of life, but because comfort can be incredibly persuasive. Comfort whispers soft arguments. Why go out when you're peaceful here? Why deal with noise when you can think clearly? Why enter chaotic spaces when your room already holds everything you need? And these arguments feel reasonable, logical, but there is a subtle psychological cost that slowly appears when life becomes too contained. Humans are not designed for constant stimulation, but we are also not designed for permanent retreat. Our minds evolved in movement, in small risks, in unpredictable encounters that challenge our assumptions about the world. Without these small exposures, something interesting begins to happen inside the brain. The imagination becomes louder than reality. When you spend long periods away from social environments, the mind starts filling the gaps with predictions. Predictions about how exhausting people will be. Predictions about awkward conversations. Predictions about being misunderstood. And here's the strange thing about predictions. The brain treats them almost like memories. So even if nothing bad has happened recently, your nervous system begins reacting to imagined outcomes as if they have already occurred. The outside world becomes heavier in your mind than it actually is, not because you're weak, but because the brain is doing what it always does, protecting you from effort, protecting you from uncertain, protecting you from emotional overstimulation. But protection, when it becomes too efficient, can quietly limit growth. A muscle that never lifts weights slowly weakens. A mind that never leaves its sanctuary slowly loses its curiosity about what exists beyond it. And yet, this doesn't mean the love of staying home is wrong. In fact, the world desperately needs people who know how to be comfortable in solitude, because solitude is where reflection happens, where creativity happens, where healing happens. The problem is not home itself. The problem is when home becomes the only place where you allow yourself to exist fully. There is a difference between choosing solitude and becoming dependent on it. The shift is subtle. Choice feels light. Dependence feels heavy. Choice says, "I could go out, but tonight I'd rather stay in." Dependence whispers, "I don't think I can go out anymore." But here's the deeper truth most people never talk about. The people who love staying home often have something incredibly valuable hidden inside them: depth. They are observers, thinkers, listeners. They notice details others rush past. They process emotions slowly and carefully. And because of this, they often experience the world with an intensity that others never fully understand. This sensitivity can make noisy environments exhausting, but it can also make quiet moments incredibly rich. A single conversation can mean more than 100 casual interactions. A single walk can hold more reflection than an entire crowded event. This is not a weakness, it's a different rhythm of life. The real question is not whether you should stop loving your home. The real question is whether you can carry the calm of your home into the outside world. Because healing does not require abandoning the sanctuary you built. It requires expanding the borders of that sanctuary. Imagine your inner peace like a lantern. Right now, it glows brightly inside your room. Inside familiar routines. Inside predictable silence. But lanterns are meant to travel. Their purpose is not just to light one place. Their purpose is to bring light into dark paths. And slowly, gently, that lantern can move. Not all at once, not dramatically, just small steps. A short walk outside. A quiet cafe visit. A conversation with one person instead of 10. The goal is not to force yourself into overwhelming environments. The goal is to teach your nervous system something new, that the world outside your walls is not always draining. That connection can exist without performance. That presence can exist without pressure. When you re-enter the world slowly like this, something surprising often happens. You begin to notice that many people are just as uncertain as you are, just as tired, just as quietly searching for places where they can be themselves. And sometimes the depth you cultivated in solitude becomes the exact thing that creates meaningful connection. Because while many people know how to talk, fewer people know how to truly see. And people who have spent time alone often develop that rare ability. They listen differently. They notice emotional shifts others ignore. They speak with care. These qualities can turn ordinary interactions into something deeper, something real. So the goal is not to erase your love for staying home. Home is not your enemy. Home is where you rebuilt yourself, where you rested, where you learned how to hear your own thoughts again. That place deserves respect, but life is not meant to stay inside one room forever. Even the quietest rivers eventually flow beyond their source. Even the most careful hearts eventually reach outward. The world does not need you to become louder, or more extroverted, or more socially fearless. It simply invites you to step outside sometimes, carrying your calm with you, because the sanctuary you built was never meant to be a cage. It was meant to be a place where you learned how to breathe again. And once you remember how to breathe, you can slowly begin walking again, step by step, moment by moment, not rushing, not forcing yourself, just allowing your world to grow slightly larger than it was yesterday. And if this story felt strangely familiar, if parts of it sounded like quiet thoughts you've carried for years, then you should know something important. You are not broken for loving solitude. You are not strange for needing quiet spaces, and you are certainly not alone. Some of the most thoughtful people in the world have walked this same path, learning how to balance the beauty of solitude with the courage of stepping back into life. So if this reflection resonated somewhere deep inside you, if it felt like someone finally put words to emotions you couldn't quite explain, then stay close to this space. Because sometimes a single quiet idea can slowly change the way we see ourselves, and sometimes the smallest step outside our walls becomes the beginning of a much larger world.